So the last topic that we're going to discuss is the impairment of long-term assets. Okay, so if you recall when we discuss the inventory write-downs, some inventories lose value significantly. Okay, so if we are talking about groceries, they are perishable. So if you are not able to sell these fresh goods within the expiration date, they lose value, basically to zero. If your Apple having this iPhone 12s or 13 sitting at the back of the storage unit or in the warehouse, they lost value significantly. Okay. So we discussed the lower of cost or net realizable value method or the lower of cost or market methods to determine the amount of the loss of the value. Similar idea applies for the impairment. Okay, so some long-term assets lose value significantly. So your job is to first determine whether or not this particular long-term asset lost value significantly and subject to impairment loss, and then if so, by how much. Okay. Some of the circumstances include a significant decrease in the market price for that long-term asset or a significant adverse change in how the asset is being used or in its physical condition. So basically, any circumstances that the management or the company thinks that this particular long-term asset lost value, they are required to conduct this impairment test first to determine whether or not it is subject to an impairment loss, and number two, by how much, the extent to which the particular long-term asset lost value. Okay. Now, for this impairment loss test, it's a two-step process. Okay. All right. So in step one, okay, in step one, what you are going to do is you are going to compare the book value of this particular asset, basically the value that you are currently reporting in the balance sheet for that asset. You're going to compare that against what we call undiscounted cash flows. Okay. Basically, what this undiscounted cash flow means is the total amount of cash that the company expects to make or collect from utilizing this particular asset. Okay, so that value will be given to you for my course purposes. So what you are going to do at the end of the day is to compare the book value against the undiscounted cash flows value. Okay. Now, if you determine that the book value is greater than undiscounted cash flows value, then we deemed that we passed the test. Okay, we passed the test. Then we're going to move on to step two. Okay, step two. Now, in step two, you are going to compare the book value of the particular asset and then compare it against the fair value. Again, the fair value will be provided to you. We just simply compare the value between the book value and then the fair value. And if your book value remains greater, okay, than the fair value, then we determine that this asset is impaired, it lost value significantly, then you are going to record the impairment journal entry, okay, accordingly. All right, so it's always like, just like last time, it's always better to use numbers to understand this impairment loss test. So let's take a look at here. All right. So this company operates several factories that manufacture medical equipment. Near the end of the company's 2026 fiscal year, a change in business climate related to a competitor's innovative products indicated to management that the $170 million book value of the assets, okay, may not be recoverable. Okay, so we have the book value. So $170 million. That number comes from the purchase price, $300 million, minus the accumulated depreciation, $130 million. Okay, so we are given the book value at $170 million. So scrolling down. In step one, the book value is $170 million. So that's the book value. Okay. Okay, compare that against the undiscounted cash flow, the amount of cash that the company expects to collect or make from utilizing this asset. Management is able to identify cash flows from this factory and estimates that the future cash flows over the remaining useful life will be $150 million. So undiscounted cash flow is $150 million. Okay, so that's undiscounted cash flows. So it looks like my book value is greater than undiscounted cash flow. So we determine that we passed the step one test. Then we're going to move on to step two. Step two, we continue to use the book value. Okay, book value, $170 million. Now, what is the fair value of this asset? The fair value of the factory's assets is estimated to be $135 million. So the fair value is $135 million. And as you can see, the book value remains greater than the fair value. Okay, so in this case, we determine that this asset lost the value significantly. There has been an impairment to this particular asset. Okay, so how much this this asset lost the value? We take the difference between the book value and the fair value. Okay, all right. So the amount of the difference is, okay, oops. So $170 million minus $135 million. $170 million minus $130 million. So the difference is $40 million. That's the amount of the impairment loss for this particular asset. Okay. So let's record the journal entry. Okay, so the journal entry that you're going to be recording. Oh, my apologies. Okay, so it was 170 million minus $135 million. So the amount of it, the impairment loss is actually $35 million. Okay, so we're going to record impairment loss on the debit side by $35 million. And then we are going to remove all of the accumulated depreciations that we have been recording. Okay, so to remove this accumulated depreciation, we're going to debit accumulated depreciation. So far, we've accumulated a total of $130 million. Okay. And then since this asset is losing value, so we're going to credit this asset at $165 million. Okay. All right. So what does this mean? This is the journal entry for the impairment loss. So what does this mean in the balance sheet? Let me draw the balance sheet here. There you go. All right. So before recording this impairment loss, I had this asset here, original purchase price, $300 million. And then we had the accumulated depreciation at $130 million. So the net value or the book value of this asset, okay, was $170 million. Okay. All right. After recording this impairment loss journal entry, the balance sheet will look like, let me copy this and then paste it onto here. Okay, so we remove the accumulated depreciation. So the accumulated depreciation is now 0. Okay, and then for the asset, previously it was $300 million. Now we decrease the value of this asset by $165 million. So now you are going to report the value of this asset at $135 million. $35 million. Since there's no accumulated depreciation, we've removed it. So the net value or the book value of this asset will remain at $135 million. Okay. As you can see, this asset lost the value by $35 million. So previously it was 170 million. Now we are reporting at 135. So $35 million loss, impairment loss. Okay. All right. So that's how you first determine whether or not this particular asset lost the value. Second, the extent, the magnitude of the loss of the value. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at this mini exercise question. This company owns the factory for which it paid $270 million. So the purchase price is $270 million. At the end of 2026, the book value of assets totaled $189 million. Okay, so the book value, step one. Okay, step one. So the book value is $189 million. Okay. Due to the adverse economic conditions, the company's management determined that it should assess whether an impairment loss should be recognized for the factory. The estimated undiscounted cash flows to be provided by the factory totaled $180 million. So undiscounted cash flows, $180 million. So the book value is greater than the cash flow. So we pass the step one test. Okay. Let's move on to step two. Okay, so the book value is $189 million. Now, what's the fair value? The fair value is $120 million. $120 million. Okay, so looks like the book value remains greater than the fair value. So we determine that this asset is subject to the impairment loss. Okay. What's the magnitude of the impairment loss? We take the difference between the book value and the fair value. Okay, so if we take the difference, so 189 million minus 120, so $69 million. So we determine that this particular asset lost the value by $69 million. So choice C is the answer. Okay. Now, I'm going to tweak change some values here and there. Okay, so what if? Okay, let me erase all of this. Okay. What if in step one, okay, the undiscounted cash flow is now $190 million. Okay, so previously it was $180 million, which was lower than the book value. So we determined that we passed step one test. What if now the undiscounted cash flow is $190 million, which is greater than the book value? That means we fail. Okay, we fail to pass step one test. Okay, so that means we determine that this asset is not subject to impairment loss. Okay, so in other words, no impairment loss here. Okay, all right. Now, let me change the values. So we keep the undiscounted cash flows at $180 million. So that means we pass step one test because book value is greater than the undiscounted cash flow. Now, what if the fair value now, is $190 million? $90 million. Okay, so we passed the step one test, but turns out that the fair value is actually greater than the book value. Okay, so in this case, even though we determine that in step one, this asset is subject to impairment loss, when it comes to quantifying or calculating the amount of impairment loss, we actually determine that there is no impairment loss to record. Okay, to record. In other words, you may pass the step one test, but it is also possible that when it comes to recording the journal entry, there's no journal entry required if the fair value happens to be greater than the book value given to you. Okay, so in other words, you must pass both the step 1 and then step 2 test in order for you to record the impairment loss journal entry. Okay. All right. So that's the end of all lectures that I wanted to cover and then discuss for the course. Okay. So hopefully you were able to keep up the pace of the lectures. If not, please dedicate more time to reviewing the materials so that you prepare yourself for the next course for Business 3-3-22. Okay. All right. So again, thank you so much for tuning in for the past 5 weeks. I really wish you the best of luck. And then I also wish you the best for your future career endeavors. Okay. All right. Have a good rest of the week. Bye.